March 25th, 2026. Day 53. For the first time since her mother vanished, Savannah Guthrie breaks her silence on camera. Tears streaming down her face, she describes waking up every single night in complete darkness, imagining her mother's terror in those final moments. "We are in agony," she tells Hoda Kotb. "It is unbearable." But as the Guthrie family openly accepts that Nancy may never be found alive, the investigation itself is collapsing from within. The sheriff leading the search just faced a devastating vote of no confidence from his own deputies. The Board of Supervisors is now investigating whether he lied under oath about his entire career. 53 days, no arrests, no body. And the man in charge of finding Nancy Guthrie is fighting to keep his own job. This is Forensic Disconnect. Today we're covering the most emotional and politically explosive developments yet in the Nancy Guthrie case. An 84-year-old woman who requires daily medication to survive, taken from her bed in the early morning hours of February 1st, 2026. Blood found on her porch. A masked suspect caught on camera. And now, 8 weeks later, a family preparing to say goodbye while the investigation crumbles under the weight of institutional failure. Before we continue, if you're following this case closely, make sure you're subscribed to Forensic Disconnect and hit that notification bell. We're covering every single development in Nancy's disappearance as it happens, and this case is far from over. New updates every week. On Wednesday morning, March 25th, the Today Show released a preview clip that sent shockwaves across the country. Savannah Guthrie, one of America's most recognized journalists, sitting down with her longtime friend and former co-host Hoda Kotb for her first on-camera interview since her mother disappeared 53 days ago. And what viewers saw was absolutely heartbreaking. Savannah, visibly emotional, struggling to hold back tears, tells Hoda something that every person following this case has been dreading to hear. Someone needs to do the right thing. We are in agony. We are in agony. It is unbearable. And to think of what she went through. She pauses, the weight of 53 days without answers pressing down on every word. "I wake up every night, in the middle of the night, every night, and in the darkness I imagine her terror. And it is unthinkable. But those thoughts demand to be thought. And I will not hide my face, but she needs to come home." Let that sink in for a moment. Every single night for nearly 8 weeks, Savannah Guthrie wakes up in darkness and imagines what her mother experienced in those final moments. The terror of being taken from her own bed, the confusion, the helplessness. An 84-year-old woman with limited mobility, dependent on daily medication for her heart condition, ripped from the safety of her home by someone wearing a ski mask and carrying a gun. Think about what that does to a person psychologically. Savannah isn't just dealing with the grief of losing her mother, she's dealing with the trauma of not knowing. Not knowing if Nancy suffered. Not knowing if she's still alive somewhere, waiting for rescue. Not knowing if she died alone and afraid in some remote location. That uncertainty is a special kind of torture that only the families of missing persons truly understand. The full interview will air on Thursday and Friday this week on the Today Show, but this preview alone has already devastated viewers across the country. The comments flooding social media show a nation heartbroken for this family. People who have followed Savannah's career for decades, who watched her co-host the Olympics, who started their mornings with her smile and professionalism, are now watching her break down on camera. The contrast is jarring. This is a woman who has interviewed presidents, covered natural disasters, reported from war zones. She's known for her composure, her intelligence, her ability to ask tough questions while maintaining empathy. And now we're seeing her completely vulnerable, stripped of that professional armor, just a daughter who wants her mother back. But here's what makes this interview even more devastating. The language Savannah and her siblings have been using in recent statements has shifted, subtly at first, but now unmistakably clear. In their statement released over the weekend, the Guthrie family wrote, "We want to celebrate her beautiful and courageous life, but we cannot do that until she is brought to her final place of rest. Final place of rest. Not until she comes home safe. Not until we find her alive." They're talking about a burial, a funeral, closure. Multiple media outlets are now reporting that while Nancy Guthrie has not been officially declared dead, the family has clearly come to terms with the reality that she is likely gone. Nancy has been without her critical heart medication for 53 days. Her pacemaker stopped syncing with her Apple Watch on February 1st at 2:28 a.m. That was the last digital trace of her life. For an 84-year-old woman who needed that medication every 24 hours to survive, the medical reality is stark, brutal, unavoidable. Nancy took medication for high blood pressure and heart conditions. According to Sheriff Nanos' statements in early February, if she went 24 hours without that medication, it could be fatal. We're now at 53 days. Even if by some miracle she was being held captive and given medication, the stress alone on an 84-year-old body would be catastrophic. The terror of abduction, the physical trauma of being moved against her will, the psychological impact of being held hostage. For someone Nancy's age, with her medical conditions, survival past the first few days would have required professional medical care, not just medication from a pharmacy, actual doctors, monitoring, equipment. It's not realistic to imagine a scenario where kidnappers could keep an 84-year-old woman with serious heart conditions alive for nearly 2 months without access to a full medical facility. And if they had access to that level of medical care, we'd be looking at an incredibly sophisticated operation. Hospital staff who would have seen her, records that would exist, a trail that investigators could follow. The absence of any such trail points to the grim conclusion the family has already accepted. Nancy Guthrie died shortly after she was taken, perhaps in the first 24 hours when her medication ran out, perhaps from the physical stress of the abduction itself, perhaps from a heart attack or stroke brought on by the terror of what was happening to her. We may never know the exact moment or cause, but the medical timeline makes it almost certain that Nancy did not survive more than a few days at most, and the family knows this. Their doctors have surely walked them through the realities. Their medical consultants have explained what happens to a body when it's deprived of critical cardiac medication. The Guthrie siblings aren't holding out hope for a miraculous rescue anymore. They're holding out hope for the recovery of their mother's body so they can lay her to rest with dignity. Despite this grim acceptance, the family continues to plead for information. In their weekend statement, they emphasized, "We continue to believe it is Tucsonans and the greater southern Arizona community that hold the key to finding resolution in this case. Someone knows something. It's possible a member of this community has information that they do not even realize is significant. They're asking residents to search their memories, to review security camera footage, to check text messages, journal notes, any observations or conversations from 3 key dates: the late evening of January 11th, the night of January 31st, the early morning hours of February 1st. The family believes someone in Tucson has the missing piece of this puzzle. A neighbor who saw something unusual, a store clerk who remembers a suspicious customer, a contractor who worked on a nearby construction site. Someone out there knows something that could bring Nancy home, even if it's only to give her that final resting place her family desperately needs. Think about what they're asking for. They're not asking for hope. They're asking for closure. They're asking for the ability to grieve properly. Right now, the Guthrie family exists in a horrific limbo. They can't grieve because there's no body. They can't have a funeral because there's no confirmation of death. They can't move forward because there are no answers. They're stuck in this awful space where their mother is gone but not officially dead. Where they know she's not coming home alive, but they can't accept it fully because there's no proof. Where every day brings a tiny, irrational sliver of hope that maybe, somehow, she's still out there, followed immediately by the crushing weight of reality. This is what's known in psychology as ambiguous loss. It's considered one of the most difficult types of grief to process because there's no closure, no finality, just endless uncertainty. And the Guthrie family has been living in that state for 53 days. Savannah also posted a message of faith on Sunday, sharing an image of Christ's ascension with the simple caption, "I believe, I believe." For a family watching their mother's case grow colder by the day while the sheriff in charge faces political destruction, faith may be all they have left. That simple statement, "I believe," carries so much weight when you understand the context. Savannah isn't saying she believes Nancy is alive. She's saying she believes in something greater than this horror. She believes there's meaning beyond the suffering. She believes her mother's soul is at peace even if her body hasn't been found. She believes that somehow, some way, there will be justice. That statement is both heartbreaking and beautiful. It shows a woman clinging to the only thing that can sustain her through this nightmare. Not false hope, not denial, but faith that there's a purpose to all of this pain that she can't see yet. But while Savannah Guthrie was preparing to bare her soul on national television, the investigation meant to find her mother was imploding behind closed doors. On Tuesday, March 24th, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos walked into what can only be described as a political execution, the Pima County Board of Supervisors meeting. The same board that has the power to investigate his conduct, strip his authority, and potentially remove him from office entirely. And what happened in that room was devastating for Nanos. During the meeting, leaders of the local deputies association stood up and announced something that rarely happens in law enforcement: a vote of no confidence in their own sheriff. Let me explain what that means and why it's such a big deal. A vote of no confidence is when the rank-and-file officers, the deputies who work under the sheriff every single day, formally declare that they have lost trust in their leader's ability to do the job. It's not just a complaint. It's not just frustration. It's an official statement that the men and women risking their lives under this sheriff's command no longer believe he is fit to lead them. This almost never happens. Law enforcement has a strong culture of loyalty and hierarchy. Officers are trained to respect the chain of command. Even when they disagree with leadership decisions, they typically handle it internally. They don't go public. They don't air their grievances in front of civilians and politicians. The fact that the Deputies Association felt compelled to announce a vote of no confidence in a public Board of Supervisors meeting tells you just how bad things have gotten within the Pima County Sheriff's Department. These aren't outside critics. These aren't political opponents. These are Nanos' own people. The deputies who work for him every single day. And they're saying publicly that they don't trust him. The Deputies Association cited a loss of trust among both rank-and-file deputies and the broader Tucson community. This is a sheriff who is supposed to be leading the highest-profile missing persons case in the country right now, and his own department just publicly stated they don't trust him. Think about what that means for the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Every detective working that case reports to Sheriff Nanos. Every decision about resource allocation, about which leads to pursue, about what information to release to the public, goes through him. And the deputies carrying out those orders just announced they have no confidence in his leadership. How does an investigation succeed under those conditions? How do you maintain morale, focus, and dedication to solving a case when the entire department is fractured and demoralized? You can't. You simply can't run an effective investigation when the rank-and-file officers have lost faith in their commander. And that's exactly what's happening in Pima County right now. After the vote of no confidence was announced, the Board of Supervisors went into a closed session, behind closed doors, for more than 2 hours. When you see a government body go into executive session for that long, you know something serious is being discussed. They're not just reviewing paperwork. They're not having a casual conversation. They're dealing with a crisis. And in this case, that crisis is the credibility and future of Sheriff Chris Nanos. When they finally reopened the session to the public, Supervisor Matt Hines, who has been one of Nanos' most vocal critics, pointed to concerns that Nanos may have misrepresented details about his work history in sworn testimony. In other words, that he lied under oath. The Board of Supervisors has now officially announced they will investigate Sheriff Chris Nanos' disciplinary record and work history. This isn't just political theater. This is a formal investigation into whether the man leading Nancy Guthrie's case fabricated his credentials, lied about his past, and committed perjury. So let's talk about what they're investigating because the details are damning. In December 2025, Sheriff Nanos gave sworn testimony in a court case. Under oath, he made specific claims about his law enforcement career. He stated that he worked for the El Paso Police Department until 1984. Public records show he actually left in 1982. That's a 2-year discrepancy. Now, you might think, maybe he just misremembered, it was decades ago. But here's the thing. When you're testifying under oath, you don't guess. You don't rely on memory for dates that can be easily verified. You check your records. You make sure you're accurate. Because the entire point of sworn testimony is that you're affirming the truthfulness of your statements under penalty of perjury. Nanos didn't misremember. He lied. And it gets worse. He also stated under oath that he had never been suspended during his career. Never. Not once. Public records tell a very different story. Nanos was suspended 8 times during his law enforcement career. 8 times. Those suspensions totaled 37 days. More than a full month of unpaid leave for disciplinary violations. And what were those violations? They included incidents involving excessive use of force. Think about that. A sheriff who is now in charge of a high-profile abduction case was suspended multiple times for using excessive force as an officer. That's not a minor disciplinary issue. That's a pattern of behavior that raises serious questions about judgment, temperament, and respect for constitutional rights. The suspensions also included gambling while off duty. Again, not a fireable offense on its own, but it shows poor judgment and a willingness to bend rules. These aren't minor discrepancies. These are fundamental lies about his professional history, told under oath in a court of law. And now, as he's supposed to be laser-focused on finding an 84-year-old kidnapping victim, He's instead fighting to save his own career. Matt Hines has been pushing for accountability for months. He's pointed out that Nanos' credibility is directly tied to public trust in this investigation. If the sheriff is lying about his own past, how can the community trust anything he says about Nancy Guthrie's case? It's a fair question, and it's one that Nanos has no good answer for. When a law enforcement official lies under oath, it doesn't just damage their personal credibility. It damages the credibility of every investigation they're involved in. Defense attorneys in criminal cases can point to Nanos' perjury and argue that his testimony or the evidence collected under his watch can't be trusted. Prosecutors have to worry that cases will be thrown out because the sheriff in charge has a documented history of lying in court. And in the Nancy Guthrie case specifically, every statement Nanos has made to the media is now suspect. When he says, "We're close to identifying a suspect," is that true? Or is he lying to protect his reputation? When he says, "We have good evidence," is that accurate? Or is he exaggerating to make the investigation seem more successful than it actually is? When he says, "This is not a cold case," is he being honest? Or is he just trying to avoid admitting failure? The public has no way to know anymore, because Sheriff Nanos has proven that he's willing to lie, even under oath when it serves his interests. That fundamental breach of trust is catastrophic for any investigation. But it's especially catastrophic for a case as high-profile and emotionally charged as Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. And here's where it gets even worse. Sheriff Nanos is also facing a recall effort. Citizens of Pima County are actively collecting signatures to remove him from office. They have 120 days from March 12th to collect 120,000 valid signatures. If they succeed, Nanos will face a recall election. The pressure is mounting from every direction. His own deputies don't trust him. The Board of Supervisors is investigating him. The public is trying to recall him, and in the middle of all this political chaos, he's supposed to be finding Nancy Guthrie. This is the man the Guthrie family is depending on. This is the man who holds daily press briefings saying the investigation is progressing, that they're closer to identifying a suspect, that they have good evidence. But how can anyone believe him when he's fighting for his political survival while his own department has declared they've lost confidence in his leadership? The recall effort isn't just about Nancy Guthrie. It's about years of complaints, controversies, and questionable decisions that preceded this case. But Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has become the focal point, the most visible example of Nanos' failures, the case that crystallized public frustration with his leadership. And if you're a Tucson resident, it's not hard to understand why. You have the mother of one of the most famous journalists in America abducted from her home in your community. You have FBI agents swarming the neighborhood. You have national media covering the story 24/7. You have a $1 million reward being offered by the family. Every resource imaginable is being thrown at this case. And yet, 53 days later, there are no arrests, no identified suspects, no major breakthroughs. Just a sheriff who keeps saying, "We're close," while his own deputies announce they don't trust him. The optics are absolutely terrible. Savannah Guthrie is on national television, tears in her eyes, begging for someone to do the right thing and bring her mother home. And the sheriff in charge of that investigation just got publicly humiliated by his own deputies and is now under formal investigation for lying under oath. This is not how you run a high-profile missing persons case. This is how you lose public trust. This is how cases go cold. And it raises a terrifying question. What happens if the recall succeeds? What happens if Nanos is removed from office in the middle of this investigation? A new sheriff comes in. They have to get up to speed on a case that's already 2 months old, 3 months old, maybe more by the time the recall election happens. They have to rebuild relationships with the FBI. They have to re-examine all the evidence. They have to figure out which leads are worth pursuing and which ones are dead ends. And all of that takes time. Time that Nancy Guthrie's family doesn't have. This is the nightmare scenario. Not just that Nancy is gone, but that the investigation meant to find her collapsed under the weight of political corruption and institutional failure. That the man in charge was more concerned with covering up his own lies than solving their case. That by the time someone competent took over, it was too late. But the crisis in leadership isn't the only bombshell that dropped this week. On Tuesday, a retired law enforcement official who used to be Sheriff Nanos' boss went on national television and shared a theory that has sent chills through everyone following this case. Rick Castigar is the former chief of police for Pima County. He was Chris Nanos' superior for years. He knows Tucson, he knows the border, he knows how these cases work. He knows the criminal networks that operate in southern Arizona. And on Brian Enton's show on News Nation, Castigar laid out a theory that is both logical and absolutely horrifying. Castigar believes that multiple people were involved in Nancy Guthrie's abduction, not just the masked man caught on camera, a team. And he believes they took Nancy across the border into Mexico. Why Mexico? Because Nancy required daily medication to stay alive, medication for her heart condition and high blood pressure. If the kidnappers wanted to keep her alive long enough to use her as leverage for ransom, they needed access to that medication. And in Mexico, you can walk into almost any pharmacy and buy prescription medication over the counter without a doctor's note. No questions asked. No records kept. No prescription required. This is a well-known reality in border states. Americans regularly cross into Mexico to buy medications that would require expensive doctor visits and prescriptions in the United States. Everything from antibiotics to heart medication to insulin can be purchased over the counter in Mexican pharmacies for a fraction of the U.S. price. Castigar explained his reasoning. What would prevent an individual who had planned this out, to the level that I think he did, from going into Mexico and harboring her someplace in Mexico where, theoretically, they could deal with her medical issues? It makes sense from a kidnapper's perspective. You've just abducted an 84-year-old woman from her home. You know she needs medication to survive. You know that if she dies in the first 24 hours, you lose your leverage. You lose your ability to extract ransom from the family. So what do? You cross the border. You're 70 miles from Nogales, Mexico. That's a 90-minute drive in the middle of the night. You get across the border. You find a pharmacy. You describe the medication you need. You pay cash. And you walk out with everything necessary to keep your hostage alive. No identification required. No trail for law enforcement to follow. No records that would connect you to the medication purchase. And once you're in Mexico, you can disappear. You can take the victim to a safe house in a remote area. You can control the situation without worrying about FBI agents canvassing the neighborhood or cadaver dogs searching vacant properties. You're beyond the reach of American law enforcement. The only way you get caught is if Mexican authorities cooperate with the investigation. And while Mexican law enforcement does work with American agencies on high-profile cases, the reality is that resources are limited, corruption is a problem, and a single missing American woman isn't going to be the top priority for agencies dealing with cartel violence and mass disappearances. If Nancy was taken to Mexico, finding her becomes exponentially more difficult. The search area goes from a few square miles in the Catalina Foothills to the entire country of Mexico. That's 761,000 square miles. It's an impossible task. But then Castigar added the part that everyone feared. However, I believe she died somehow while that plan may have been attempted. Nancy Guthrie, in this theory, was taken to Mexico. The kidnappers tried to keep her alive with medication they purchased at a Mexican pharmacy, but something went wrong. Maybe the stress was too much for her heart. Maybe they couldn't get the right dosages. Maybe they didn't understand the complexity of her medical needs. Maybe she had a medical emergency they couldn't handle. Maybe she went into cardiac arrest and they had no way to revive her. Whatever happened, Castigar believes Nancy Guthrie died in Mexico while her kidnappers were still trying to figure out how to ransom her. And here's the detail that Castigar pointed to as evidence for his theory. The family's public statements. Savannah and her siblings keep saying they want Nancy brought home, but they don't say brought home alive. They say brought to her final place of rest. Castigar's interpretation, my theory is that she's passed. My theory is that they, the perpetrators, really have nothing with which to bargain any further, and what they may have done with her, I don't know. If Castigar is right, Nancy Guthrie's body could be anywhere in Mexico, buried in a desert somewhere outside Hermosillo or Guaymas, dumped in a remote canyon in the Sierra Madre, hidden in an abandoned building in a small border town, disposed of in a way that ensures she'll never be found. And the people responsible are sitting on the other side of the border, knowing they can't extract a ransom from a dead hostage, with no way to negotiate and no incentive to reveal where she is. Because revealing her location means admitting their involvement, and if they're in Mexico, they have no reason to do that. They're safe. They got away with it. This theory aligns with what we know. We know Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing at 2:28 a.m. on February 1st. We know she needed medication within 24 hours to survive. We know the masked suspect had extensive time to plan this, suggesting it wasn't a random crime of opportunity. We know Tucson is less than 70 miles from the Mexican border, a 90-minute drive in the middle of the night, easy to do without being noticed. Interstate 19 runs straight from Tucson to Nogales. At 2:30 in the morning, that highway is nearly empty. You could make that drive in an hour if you were speeding, And we know that despite 53 days of searching, despite FBI involvement, despite cadaver dogs and widespread searches of vacant properties in the Catalina foothills, authorities have found absolutely nothing. No body, no additional evidence, no ransom contact that led anywhere. If Nancy was taken to Mexico, it would explain why the search in Arizona has turned up empty. It would explain why the investigation has stalled. It would explain why the family is preparing for a funeral instead of a reunion. But it also means that unless someone talks, unless one of the people involved comes forward with information, Nancy Guthrie may never be found. Her family may never get that closure, that final resting place, and the people responsible may never face justice, because extradition from Mexico is complicated. If the kidnappers are Mexican nationals, the Mexican government has no obligation to hand them over to American authorities. They can be prosecuted in Mexico, but that requires Mexican authorities to first identify them, arrest them, and charge them. And without cooperation from the suspects themselves, without witnesses, without evidence that crosses the border, building a case becomes nearly impossible. Rick Castigar's theory is grim, but given everything we know about this case, it's also one of the most plausible explanations for what happened to Nancy Guthrie. It explains the medical angle. It explains the planning. It explains the lack of evidence in Arizona. It explains why no ransom demands have materialized. And it explains why the family has accepted that Nancy is gone. While Castigar was sharing his Mexico theory, another former federal agent was launching a very public attack on how this investigation has been handled from the beginning. Jennifer Coffindaffer is a retired FBI special agent and criminal investigation analyst. She's been following the Nancy Guthrie case closely, and she is not happy with what she's seeing. On March 24th, Coffindaffer took to social media to blast the investigation's approach, calling it a cloak and dagger strategy that is actively hurting the search for Nancy. Her main criticism: the investigation is too secretive. Authorities are holding information too close to the vest, refusing to share details that could help generate useful tips from the public. Coffindaffer argues that investigators could encourage more actionable leads by providing clearer information about what witnesses should be looking for. Instead, they're operating in near total silence, releasing almost no new information, and expecting the public to somehow provide the missing pieces without knowing what the puzzle even looks like. This reflects a long-standing debate in law enforcement about how much information to share during an active investigation. On one side, you have the argument for transparency. The more you tell the public, the more eyes and ears you have helping you solve the case. Someone out there might have seen the suspect buying supplies at a hardware store. Someone might have noticed a suspicious vehicle in the neighborhood. Someone might remember a conversation they overheard that now seems significant, but they'll only come forward if they know what to look for. If you don't tell them what kind of vehicle you're interested in, they won't think to report the white van they saw parked near Nancy's house 3 days before she disappeared. If you don't tell them you're looking for someone who purchased rope and duct tape, they won't think to mention the nervous customer who paid cash for those exact items at their store. On the other side, you have the argument for secrecy. The less you tell the public, the more control you have over the investigation. You protect evidence that only the real perpetrator would know about, which helps you rule out false confessions and identify the actual suspect when you find them. You avoid tipping off the suspect about what you know and what you're looking for. You prevent defense attorneys from building their case before you've even made an arrest. You reduce the number of false tips from attention seekers and conspiracy theorists who waste investigative resources. Both approaches have merit, and the right balance depends on the specific case. But Jennifer Coffindaffer clearly believes that in Nancy Guthrie's case, investigators have swung too far towards secrecy. And given that the case has now gone 53 days with no arrests, no identified suspects, and no major breakthroughs, it's hard to argue that their current strategy is working. Coffindaffer isn't alone in her criticism. Former FBI Special Agent Harry Trombitas told Yahoo News that while the motive could initially have been ransom, it's appearing less and less likely as time goes on. There's too much involved, he said. There are too many ways people can get caught. High-stakes kidnappings for ransom are extremely rare in the United States and have decreased significantly over the years, Trombitas explained. The risk is too high. The chances of getting caught are too great. The logistics are too complicated. Think about what's involved in a ransom kidnapping. You have to abduct the victim without being seen. You have to hold them somewhere secure without neighbors noticing. You have to keep them alive and relatively healthy if you want to prove they're still worth paying for. You have to make contact with the family in a way that can't be traced. You have to negotiate a ransom amount. You have to arrange a payment method that doesn't leave a trail. Cash drops are dangerous because law enforcement can stake them out. Wire transfers can be traced. Cryptocurrency can be tracked with blockchain analysis. You have to actually collect the ransom without getting caught. And then you have to release the victim without them being able to identify you or lead police back to where they were held. Every single one of those steps is an opportunity to make a mistake, to leave evidence, to be spotted by a witness, to have your phone traced, to have your financial transactions tracked. The FBI has entire units dedicated to kidnapping investigations. They have decades of experience. They have technology that can track suspects across the country. The odds of successfully pulling off a ransom kidnapping in 2026 and getting away with it are incredibly low, which brings us back to the central mystery of this case. If it wasn't for ransom, why was Nancy Guthrie targeted? Sheriff Nanos told NBC Nightly News earlier this month that investigators believe they know why Nancy Guthrie's home was targeted. He also didn't rule out the possibility that the kidnapper could strike again, suggesting there may be a danger to the public. But he refused to elaborate. He won't say what the motive is. He won't say why they think Nancy's home specifically was chosen. He won't say whether they believe this was a crime of opportunity or a meticulously planned abduction. The secrecy Coffin Daffer is criticizing is on full display. And as the days turn into weeks and the weeks turn into months, that secrecy is starting to look less like careful investigative strategy and more like a department that simply doesn't have answers. If investigators truly knew why Nancy's home was targeted, they would have a suspect. If they knew the motive, they would know who to look for. The fact that they're keeping it secret suggests one of two things. Either they're protecting an ongoing investigation, and they genuinely believe releasing that information would compromise their ability to make an arrest. Or they don't actually know the motive and they're claiming they do to avoid admitting the investigation has stalled. Given Sheriff Nanos' track record of lying under oath, it's not unreasonable to suspect the latter. Meanwhile, the investigation continues to explore angles that have been present since the very beginning. Let's talk about January 11th because this date keeps coming up, and the story around it keeps getting more confusing. Investigators have been asking Nancy Guthrie's neighbors for security camera footage from January 11th, nearly 3 weeks before she disappeared. For a while, there was speculation that one of the images of the masked suspect released by the FBI might have been from that earlier date. The theory was that the suspect had visited Nancy's home on January 11th, possibly scoping it out, testing her security system, or even attempting an earlier abduction that failed. But then in late March, Sheriff Nanos clarified the situation. Sort of. He explained that when investigators were working with Google to recover footage from Nancy's Nest doorbell camera, Google initially told them that one of the images might be from January 11th. But Google later retracted that statement, saying they could not definitively determine the date the image was captured because there were no timestamps on the footage. So the January 11th connection seemed to fall apart. The masked suspect image couldn't be confirmed as being from January 11th. It could have been from February 1st. It could have been from some other date. Without timestamps, there was no way to know, except it didn't fall apart. Because in the very same interview where Nanos explained Google's retraction, he also said this: "We do believe that something occurred on January 11th, and that's with the FBI's analysis of the equipment and digital stuff they've done." So even though Google can't confirm the masked suspect image is from January 11th, the FBI still believes something significant happened on that date. What that something is, Nanos refuses to say. But investigators are still specifically asking neighbors for footage from January 11th. They're still treating it as a key date in the timeline, which suggests that even without the Google timestamp, they have other reasons to believe the suspect was in the area on that night. Maybe they found digital evidence on Nancy's security system that indicates tampering or unusual activity on January 11th. Maybe Nancy herself mentioned to a family member that something strange happened that night. Maybe a neighbor reported seeing someone suspicious on that date, and investigators later connected it to the case. Maybe cell phone records or other data place a person of interest near Nancy's home that evening. We don't know, because once again, the investigators won't say. What we do know is that January 11th is 21 days before Nancy disappeared. 3 full weeks. If the suspect was at her home on January 11th, that suggests an extended period of planning and surveillance. It suggests this wasn't a random crime. It suggests someone was watching Nancy, studying her routine, testing her security, and preparing for the abduction weeks in advance. And that level of planning points to something far more sinister than a crime of opportunity. This wasn't someone who saw an elderly woman and decided on impulse to abduct her. This was someone who targeted Nancy Guthrie specifically, who studied her for weeks, who planned every detail, who knew her schedule, her vulnerabilities, her security setup, who prepared for contingencies, who executed a plan that was sophisticated enough to leave almost no evidence behind. That kind of planning suggests a professional, or someone with law enforcement or military training, someone who understood how investigations work and how to avoid leaving traces, someone who knew that doorbell cameras can be disabled, that pacemakers stop syncing when they're out of range, that the window between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. is when neighborhoods are most deserted and witnesses are least likely to be awake. Someone who understood all of that and used it to their advantage. Investigators have also asked at least one neighbor about footage from January 24th, which is exactly 1 week before Nancy disappeared. That was a Friday night, the weekend before she was taken. Again, authorities won't say why that date is significant, but the pattern is clear. They believe the suspect was active in Nancy's neighborhood for weeks before the abduction, watching, waiting, planning. And somehow, despite all that activity, despite surveillance cameras, despite neighbors, despite a gated community, this person managed to carry out a nearly perfect crime. News Nation's Brian Enton has been covering this case extensively, and he's developed a theory that investigators might be closer to identifying the suspect than they're letting on. Enton's theory, which he calls the right under their fingertips angle, suggests that the kidnapper is someone the investigators have already looked at, someone they've already questioned, someone whose name is already in the case file. But they can't quite connect the dots. They don't have enough evidence to make an arrest. They're waiting for that one piece of information, that one witness, that one tip that ties it all together. And Enton believes that piece of information is sitting right there in the Tucson community. Someone knows something. Someone saw something. Someone heard something. And they might not even realize it's important. This theory aligns with what the Guthrie family has been saying in their public statements. They keep emphasizing that people in Tucson hold the key, that someone in the community has information they don't realize is significant, that neighbors, friends, and residents need to search their memories and think back to those key dates in January and February. Enton points to several investigative threads that suggest police are focusing on specific individuals or groups. The FBI has been asking neighbors about former residents who moved out of the area shortly before Nancy's disappearance. Think about that for a moment. Why would former residents be relevant? Because they would have had access to the neighborhood. They would have known the layout. They would have known Nancy. They could have observed her routine while they lived there. And then they moved away right before she disappeared. That's suspicious. That's the kind of timing that makes investigators pay attention. They've been asking about construction workers who were working on nearby properties. Again, this makes sense. Construction workers have a legitimate reason to be in a neighborhood for extended periods. They can observe homes and residents without raising suspicion. They know when people are home and when they're not. They see who has security systems and who doesn't. They know the rhythms of a community because they're there day after day, week after week. And if one of those construction workers had a criminal background, or if they had connections to people who commit crimes, they could gather intelligence and pass it along, or they could commit the crime themselves after they've finished the job and left the area. They've been visiting gun shops with photographs of potential suspects, asking owners to check their sales records. This suggests investigators have identified specific individuals they want to know more about. They're trying to determine if these people purchased weapons, and specifically, they're interested in gun purchases that might match the weapon the masked suspect was carrying in the doorbell camera footage. They've detained multiple people for questioning, including a man named Carlos who was held for several days before being released without charges. When someone is detained for multiple days in a missing persons case, it means investigators thought they had something. They had enough suspicion to bring the person in. They had enough questions to justify holding them. But ultimately, they didn't have enough evidence to charge them. Carlos was released, but his name is in the file. His connection to the case, whatever it is, has been documented. And if new evidence emerges that ties back to him, investigators know exactly where to find him. All of this suggests that investigators aren't starting from zero. They have leads. They have persons of interest. They have theories about who might be responsible, but they can't make an arrest without evidence. And that's where the community comes in. Because if Enton's theory is correct, someone out there has the missing piece. A neighbor who saw a construction worker acting suspiciously near Nancy's property. A store clerk who remembers someone buying supplies that seem odd in retrospect. Maybe someone purchased large quantities of rope, duct tape, zip ties. Maybe someone bought cleaning supplies that would be used to eliminate evidence. Maybe someone purchased medication that matches what Nancy needed for her heart condition. A friend who heard someone make a comment about Nancy Guthrie that didn't seem important at the time, but now takes on new meaning. Maybe someone said they'd been to her house. Maybe someone mentioned knowing she lived alone. Maybe someone made a joke about how easy it would be to rob a house in that neighborhood. Comments that seemed innocuous in January but are now chilling in retrospect. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. That's 1-800-225-5324. The family is offering a $1 million reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery. The FBI is offering an additional $100,000 reward. If you live in Tucson, if you were in the Catalina Foothills area between January 11th and February 1st, if you have security camera footage from those dates, if you remember anything unusual, no matter how small, contact the FBI. Because according to Brian Enton's theory, you might be the person holding the key to solving this case. One of the theories that keeps resurfacing is the possibility that there was a second person involved. Let me explain why investigators think this, because it's based on physical evidence, not just speculation. Nancy Guthrie's home has a security gate at the front door. It's a sturdy metal gate, the kind designed to prevent forced entry. You see these types of gates in a lot of homes in Tucson and other areas where home security is a concern. They're made of thick metal bars, they're anchored into the door frame, and they're locked from the inside. And according to law enforcement experts who've examined the setup, that gate would be nearly impossible to break through from the outside without making a tremendous amount of noise and leaving obvious signs of forced entry. When these gates are forced, the metal bends, the lock mechanism breaks, the door frame splinters. It's violent, it's loud, it's unmistakable. But there were no signs of forced entry on the gate. None. The gate was intact. The lock wasn't broken. The door frame wasn't damaged. Which means one of two things happened. Either the gate was unlocked from the inside by someone who was already in the house, or Nancy herself opened the gate, perhaps thinking she knew the person on the other side. The second theory has been explored. Could Nancy have known her abductor? Could it have been someone she trusted enough to open the door for in the middle of the night? But Nancy was sharp. Her cognitive abilities were excellent, according to Sheriff Nanos. This wasn't a woman suffering from dementia or confusion. She wasn't someone who would open her door to a stranger at 2 a.m. without a very good reason, and her family has been adamant that she wouldn't have left willingly with anyone. If someone knocked on her door at 2 in the morning, Nancy's first instinct would be to call her daughter Annie, who lives nearby, or to call 911, not to open the door and let them in, which brings us back to the two-person theory. The masked suspect we see on the doorbell camera was outside, but someone else was already inside, waiting. That inside person disabled the security system, unlocked the gate from the inside, and helped move Nancy out of the house. This theory would explain several puzzling aspects of the crime. It would explain how the suspect got through the security gate without forced entry. It would explain how someone was able to remove an 84-year-old woman with limited mobility from her home quickly and quietly. Nancy couldn't walk long distances. She needed assistance getting around. Moving her from her bedroom to a vehicle would have required help. One person could do it, but two people could do it much more easily and quickly. It would explain why there's so little physical evidence at the scene beyond Nancy's blood on the porch. If there were two people working together, one who knew the house and one who carried out the actual abduction, they could have planned how to minimize evidence, where to step, what to touch, what to avoid. It would explain the level of planning and sophistication. Getting someone inside Nancy's house before the abduction would require detailed knowledge of her routine, her security system, her habits. It would require someone she trusted. If there were two people working together, one who had legitimate access to Nancy's home and one who carried out the actual abduction, it becomes a much more sophisticated crime. And it points to someone in Nancy's inner circle, someone who had been to her home before, someone who knew the layout, someone who knew her routine, someone she trusted. The Pima County Sheriff's Department cleared all Guthrie family members, including siblings and spouses, as possible suspects early in the investigation. Tommaso Cioni, Annie Guthrie's husband, was specifically cleared after online speculation focused on him due to his presence at the scene and his emotional reactions. And the family has been adamant that no one in their circle would have betrayed Nancy like this. But inner circle doesn't just mean family. It could mean a neighbor, someone Nancy saw regularly and trusted. Someone who waved hello when she checked her mail, someone who helped her carry groceries, someone who seemed kind and helpful but was actually gathering information. It could mean a contractor or maintenance worker, someone who had been to Nancy's home to fix something, a plumber, an electrician, an HVAC technician, an appliance repair person. Someone who had a legitimate reason to be inside her house and who used that opportunity to study her security setup. It could mean a caregiver or home health aide. We don't know if Nancy had anyone helping her with daily tasks, but at 84 with limited mobility, it's possible. If she did, that person would have had extensive access to her home and detailed knowledge of her routine. It could mean a friend or acquaintance from church. Nancy attended virtual church services regularly. She had friends in the Tucson community. Someone from that social circle could have gained her trust over time. And it could mean someone completely unexpected. Someone who inserted themselves into Nancy's life specifically to set up this crime. Someone who engineered a relationship with her months ago with the intention of eventually exploiting that trust. NewsNation's Brian Entin has reported that FBI agents have returned to Nancy's neighborhood specifically to ask about former neighbors who moved out shortly before the abduction. They've also been asking about construction workers who were working on a nearby home that was under renovation. One resident told Entin that her friend has a house under construction in the area, and FBI agents asked for the names of all the contractors and workers who had been on that property. This is significant. Construction workers would have had a legitimate reason to be in the neighborhood during the weeks leading up to Nancy's disappearance. They would have had access to the area without raising suspicion. They could have observed Nancy's routine while appearing to be doing their jobs. They could have noticed when she was home alone, when her family visited, when she went to bed, when lights went on and off. All of that information would be valuable for planning an abduction. And here's the critical detail. If one of those construction workers had a criminal background, or if they were connected to organized crime, or if they were working with someone else, you suddenly have a scenario where an inside-outside team could have pulled off this abduction. The construction worker who knows the neighborhood, who has observed Nancy for weeks, who knows her routine and her vulnerabilities, and the accomplice who actually carries out the crime. Maybe that accomplice is someone the construction worker knows from their past. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's someone they met in prison. But together, they have the knowledge and the capability to target Nancy Guthrie and successfully abduct her. It's a theory, but it's a theory that FBI agents are apparently taking seriously enough to track down every single worker who was in that area in January. They're checking backgrounds, they're asking about behavior. They're looking for anyone who seemed overly interested in the neighborhood or who asked unusual questions about the residents. Let's talk about the DNA evidence, because this is both the most promising lead in the case and the most frustrating. Investigators found DNA at Nancy Guthrie's house. Multiple samples. Mixed DNA, meaning it came from more than one person. Now, finding multiple DNA samples in someone's home isn't unusual. Your home is full of your DNA and the DNA of people who visit you. Family members, friends, repair people, mail carriers. Anyone who touches a surface in your home leaves behind trace amounts of DNA. So when investigators process a crime scene, they expect to find DNA from multiple people. The challenge is figuring out which DNA is relevant to the crime and which DNA is just background noise. Some of that DNA found in Nancy's house has been identified. It belongs to Nancy herself. It belongs to her family members who had been to her home recently. It belongs to people who had legitimate reasons to be there and whose presence doesn't raise any red flags. But some of it remains unidentified, and this is where things get interesting and frustrating at the same time. That unidentified DNA has been run through every federal database available. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System used by law enforcement across the United States. CODIS contains DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees in certain states, forensic evidence from crime scenes, and missing persons. It's a massive database with millions of profiles, and investigators can compare unknown DNA from a crime scene against all of those profiles to look for a match. But Nancy Guthrie's unidentified DNA came back with no match, which means whoever left that DNA has never been arrested for a felony that would require DNA collection, has never had their DNA entered into the system voluntarily, is not connected to any other crime scene where DNA was collected, is not in any law enforcement database. For investigators, this is incredibly frustrating. They potentially have the DNA of Nancy Guthrie's kidnapper. They have biological evidence that could definitively identify the person responsible, but without a match in the database, that DNA is useless for identifying a suspect. It can only be used to confirm a suspect once they've already been identified through other means. If investigators develop a suspect through witness testimony or surveillance footage or tips from the community, they can use the DNA to prove that person was in Nancy's house. But they can't use the DNA to figure out who that person is in the first place. It's like having the answer to a test but not being able to read it because it's written in a language you don't understand. The information is there, the evidence is there, but it can't tell you what you need to know. This is where genetic genealogy comes in. Sheriff Nanos has said that investigators are exploring the use of genetic genealogy to try to identify the source of the unknown DNA. Genetic genealogy is the technique that famously solved the Golden State Killer case after decades of the killer being unidentified. Here's how it works. Investigators take the DNA profile from the crime scene and upload it to public genealogy databases like GED Match or Family Tree DNA. These are websites where people voluntarily submit their DNA to trace their family trees, find relatives, and learn about their ancestry. When someone uploads their DNA to these sites, they're essentially saying, here's my genetic information, and I'm okay with it being searchable by other people who are also interested in genealogy. What most people don't realize is that law enforcement can also search these databases. And when they do, they're not looking for exact matches, they're looking for partial matches, distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who share enough DNA with the suspect to indicate a family connection, even if they're not closely related. Once investigators find these distant relatives, they start building a family tree. They use genealogy records, public documents, social media, obituaries, anything they can find to map out how these different people are related to each other. And then they work backward and forward through the family tree to identify potential candidates who match the age, location, and other characteristics of the suspect. They narrow down the pool. They eliminate people who have alibis or who don't match the physical description, and eventually, they zero in on one or a small number of people who could be the source of the DNA. Then they try to obtain a fresh DNA sample from those individuals. Maybe they follow the person and collect a discarded coffee cup or cigarette butt. Maybe they approach the person's relatives and ask them to voluntarily provide DNA. Maybe they execute a search warrant if they have enough evidence. And once they get that fresh sample, they compare it to the crime scene DNA. If it matches, they've identified their suspect. It's a painstaking process. It can take months, sometimes years. It requires specialized knowledge of genetics and genealogy. It requires building out massive family trees with hundreds or thousands of individuals. It requires cross-referencing databases, following leads, eliminating false positives. But it works. It's been used to solve cold cases from decades ago. It's identified serial killers who thought they'd gotten away with their crimes. It's brought closure to families who had given up hope of ever knowing what happened to their loved ones. The question is whether investigators can use it fast enough to make a difference in Nancy Guthrie's case. Because unlike a cold case from 30 years ago, there's urgency here. Every day that passes is another day that evidence could be destroyed. Another day that witnesses' memories fade. Another day that the trail goes colder. If genetic genealogy eventually identifies the kidnapper 6 months from now or a year from now, will it be too late to get justice? Will the suspect have already disposed of evidence? Will witnesses have moved away or forgotten critical details? Will the case be too degraded to prosecute successfully? But there's another problem. Genetic genealogy only works if the suspect's relatives have uploaded their DNA to public databases. If the kidnapper comes from a family that hasn't participated in consumer DNA testing, there won't be any matches. No distant cousins to build a family tree from. No starting point for the genealogical investigation. And the DNA evidence becomes a dead end. This is more likely in certain communities. People who are privacy conscious and don't trust commercial DNA companies with their genetic information. People from immigrant communities who may not have as much genealogical information available in U.S. databases. People whose families haven't had the disposable income to spend on DNA ancestry kits. If Nancy's kidnapper comes from any of these backgrounds, genetic genealogy may not be able to help. Sheriff Nanos told reporters earlier this month that the DNA evidence they've collected has not produced anything promising so far. He emphasized how extensively detectives went over the house, especially in the first few days, processing every surface, every item, every potential piece of evidence. They swabbed doorknobs, they collected fibers, they photographed every inch of the crime scene. They bagged and tagged everything that could possibly contain DNA. But despite all that effort, they're still waiting for a breakthrough. They're still waiting for the DNA to tell them something useful. They're still waiting for the evidence to point them toward a suspect. And that's assuming the DNA they found is even from the kidnapper. It's possible the unidentified DNA belongs to someone completely unrelated to the crime. A delivery person who touched Nancy's front door 2 weeks before the abduction. A contractor who fixed something in her house months ago. a friend who visited and whose DNA was never collected for comparison. Investigators can't know for certain whether the unidentified DNA is relevant until they identify whose DNA it is. And that brings us right back to the same problem. They need more information, more leads, more tips from the public. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has also confirmed that cadaver dogs are no longer being used in the search for Nancy. This is significant, and the implications are sobering. Cadaver dogs are trained to detect the scent of human decomposition. They're not trained to find living people. They're trained to find bodies. When investigators bring in cadaver dogs, it means they believe they're searching for remains, not a living victim. The fact that cadaver dogs were used at all in Nancy's case tells you that investigators were preparing for the worst from very early on. And the fact that they've now stopped using cadaver dogs suggests one of two things. Either they believe Nancy was taken out of the immediate area, possibly to Mexico, as Castigar theorized, making local searches with cadaver dogs futile. If Nancy died in Mexico or was taken somewhere far from Tucson, cadaver dogs in the Catalina Foothills aren't going to find her. Or they've exhausted all the locations in the Catalina Foothills where a body could reasonably be hidden, and they've found nothing. Cadaver dogs can detect remains buried underground. They can detect remains in water. They can detect remains that have been moved or hidden. If there was a body anywhere in the search area, those dogs would have alerted on it. The fact that they didn't means one of two things. Either there's no body in the search area because Nancy was taken somewhere else, or the body is so well hidden, so deeply buried, or so thoroughly disposed of that even cadaver dogs can't detect it. Neither option is good news. It means the ground search in Tucson has essentially ended. Law enforcement has covered the area. They've checked vacant properties. They've searched open desert. They've looked in places where someone might dispose of a body quickly. They've found nothing. Whatever happens next in this case will come from tips, witnesses, DNA analysis, or investigative breakthroughs, not from search teams finding Nancy's body in a vacant lot or desert burial site. The investigation is now a waiting game, waiting for someone to talk, waiting for DNA results from genetic genealogy, waiting for a tip that actually leads somewhere, waiting for a witness to come forward with information they didn't realize was important. And while investigators wait, Savannah Guthrie wakes up every night in darkness, imagining her mother's terror. Sheriff Nanos continues to insist this is not a cold case. In his recent interview with local media, he was adamant about that. "We have so much in front of us, and we believe we have good evidence in front of us," Nanos said. "Will that dry up? Could I be wrong?" "Absolutely. Anything is possible, but we're not giving up." He emphasized that investigators continue to comb through thousands of videos and tips they've received, trying to prioritize information that is most promising. But here's the brutal reality. Sheriff Nanos said the exact same things 2 weeks ago, and 3 weeks ago, and a month ago. "We're close to identifying a suspect. We have good evidence. We believe we know why Nancy's home was targeted. This is an active investigation, not a cold case. But no arrests, no named suspects, no major announcements, no breakthroughs, just the same reassurances, repeated week after week, while Nancy Guthrie's family prepares for a funeral. And now, with Nanos fighting to save his own career, facing a vote of no confidence from his own deputies and a formal investigation from the Board of Supervisors into whether he lied under oath, those reassurances ring hollow. How can the public trust a sheriff who lied under oath about his own work history? How can the Guthrie family have faith in a man who's spending more time defending himself politically than focusing on their mother's case? How can anyone believe his statements about the investigation's progress when he's proven willing to lie to protect his reputation? The answer is they can't. And that erosion of trust is devastating for this case. Because solving Nancy Guthrie's disappearance requires public cooperation. It requires people to come forward with tips. It requires witnesses to trust that their information will be taken seriously and acted upon. It requires the community to believe that law enforcement is competent and honest and dedicated to finding the truth. When the sheriff at the center of the investigation has been exposed as a liar, when his own deputies have announced they don't trust him, when he's under investigation for perjury, that public trust evaporates, and with it goes the willingness of witnesses to come forward. The optics are disastrous. Savannah Guthrie is on national television crying, begging someone to do the right thing and bring her mother home. And the sheriff supposedly leading the search for her mother just got destroyed in a public Board of Supervisors meeting by his own department's vote of no confidence. The contrast couldn't be starker. A family in agony, pleading for help, and a sheriff fighting to save his own career instead of solving their case. And public trust in this investigation is eroding rapidly. Which brings us to the recall effort, because this is where the political crisis and the investigative crisis collide in the worst possible way. Citizens of Pima County have had enough. They're organizing to remove Sheriff Nanos from office through a recall election. The recall petition was filed on March 12, 2026. The organizers have 120 days from that date to collect 120,000 valid signatures from registered voters in Pima County. That's a high bar. 120,000 signatures is a lot. You need volunteers going door to door. You need petition gatherers at supermarkets and shopping centers. You need publicity to let people know the recall effort exists. You need organization and funding and momentum. But given the vote of no confidence from Nanos' own deputies, the Board of Supervisors' investigation into his perjury, the mishandling of the Nancy Guthrie case, and the mounting evidence of his dishonesty, it's hard to imagine the recall effort failing. The momentum is there. The anger is there. The public frustration is there. And if they succeed in collecting 120,000 valid signatures, Nanos will face a recall election. He'll have to defend his record to the voters. He'll have to explain why he lied under oath. He'll have to justify why his own deputies have lost confidence in him. He'll have to answer for the lack of progress in the Nancy Guthrie case. And given everything that's come to light, it's hard to imagine him surviving that election. The recall effort isn't just about Nancy Guthrie. It's about years of complaints, controversies, and questionable decisions that preceded this case. But the Nancy Guthrie case has become the focal point, the most visible failure, the most public example of why Pima County needs new leadership. Every news story about Nancy's disappearance mentions Nanos. Every update about the investigation includes his statements. And now, every story about Nanos' political troubles is tied back to Nancy's case. If the recall succeeds, Nanos will be removed from office, and a new sheriff will be appointed or elected depending on Arizona law and Pima County procedures. That new sheriff will inherit a mess. They'll inherit the Nancy Guthrie case, which by that time could be 6 months old, 8 months old, maybe even a year old. They'll inherit a department that's been demoralized and fractured by the vote of no confidence. They'll inherit an investigation that is stalled out with no arrests and no clear path forward. They'll inherit evidence that's been sitting in storage for months. They'll inherit witness statements that are now dated and potentially unreliable as memories fade. They'll inherit a community that's lost faith in law enforcement's ability to solve this case. And they'll be expected to somehow make progress where their predecessor failed. It's a nightmare scenario, not just for the new sheriff, but for Nancy Guthrie's family. Because every day that passes is another day that evidence degrades. Physical evidence breaks down over time. DNA samples degrade. Fingerprints become less clear. Trace evidence is lost. And testimonial evidence gets worse too. Witnesses forget details. Their memories become contaminated by media coverage and conversations with other people. They start to question what they actually saw versus what they think they saw. If the recall drags on for months, if there's a contentious election, if there's a transition period where the new sheriff is getting up to speed, that's months of lost time. Months where the investigation is essentially on hold while political processes play out. Months where whoever kidnapped Nancy Guthrie is sitting somewhere feeling more and more confident that they got away with it. This is the nightmare scenario for the Guthrie family. Not just that their mother is gone, but that the investigation meant to find her collapsed under the weight of political corruption and institutional failure. That the man in charge was more concerned with covering up his own lies than solving their case. That by the time someone competent took over, it was too late to get justice. 53 days. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 53 days. Her pacemaker stopped syncing on February 1st at 2:28 a.m. She needed daily medication to survive. Medication she didn't have with her. Medication she couldn't access. The medical reality is inescapable. An 84-year-old woman with serious heart conditions cannot survive for 53 days without her medication. She cannot survive the stress and trauma of an abduction. She cannot survive being held in whatever conditions her kidnapper subjected her to. The family knows this. Their doctors have told them. Medical experts have explained the timeline. There is no realistic scenario where Nancy Guthrie is still alive 53 days later, and her family has accepted that. Savannah Guthrie, sitting across from Hoda Kotb, tears streaming down her face, is not asking for her mother to be found alive anymore. She's asking for her mother to be brought home, to be brought to her final resting place, so the family can grieve, so they can have a funeral, so they can say goodbye, so they can celebrate Nancy's beautiful and courageous life. Even that small mercy has been denied to them for 53 days. Think about what that means. Savannah Guthrie cannot grieve properly for her mother because there's no body. She cannot have a funeral because there's no confirmation of death. She cannot move forward with her life because there's no closure. She's stuck in this awful limbo where her mother is gone but not officially dead, where she knows in her heart that Nancy is never coming home alive, but she can't fully accept it because investigators haven't confirmed it, where every day brings a tiny, irrational hope that maybe she's wrong, followed immediately by the crushing weight of reality. And she's living that cycle over and over, day after day, night after night, waking up in darkness, imagining her mother's terror. That's what 53 days of ambiguous loss does to a person. That's the psychological torture of not knowing. That's why bringing Nancy home, even if it's only her remains, is so desperately important to this family. The person or people responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance are still out there. Maybe they're in Tucson, watching the news coverage, seeing the investigation crumble, feeling more confident every day that they're going to get away with it. Maybe they're in Mexico, knowing they're beyond the reach of American law enforcement, living their lives while Nancy's family suffers. Maybe they're construction workers who've moved on to another job in another city, blending back into normal life like nothing happened. Maybe they're sitting in a house just miles from where Nancy was taken, confident they covered their tracks well enough that they'll never be caught. Maybe they're reading about Sheriff Nanos' political troubles and thinking that the chaos is actually helping them, because the longer the investigation is paralyzed by leadership failures, the colder the trail gets. But here's what we know. Someone knows something. Brian Enton is absolutely right about that. The answer to this case is sitting in the Tucson community right now, in someone's memory, in someone's security camera footage, in someone's journal notes or text messages from January, a neighbor who saw someone suspicious, who saw a vehicle they didn't recognize parked near Nancy's house, who saw someone walking through the neighborhood at an unusual hour, who saw a construction worker doing something that seemed odd at the time but didn't think it was important enough to report, a store clerk who sold supplies to someone who seemed off, who sold rope and duct tape and cleaning supplies to someone who was nervous and paid in cash, who sold medication that matches what Nancy needed to someone who couldn't explain why they needed it, who interacted with someone in mid-January who was asking strange questions about the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, a friend who heard a comment that didn't make sense at the time, but now seems significant, who heard someone mention Nancy Guthrie's name before she went missing, who heard someone talk about how easy it would be to get into houses in that neighborhood, who heard someone express resentment or anger toward wealthy elderly people living alone. Comments that seemed like casual conversation in January but are now chilling in the context of what happened. That person is out there. They might not even realize what they know is important. They might think, oh, lots of people buy rope at hardware stores. That's not unusual. They might think, lots of vehicles drive through neighborhoods. I can't report everyone I don't recognize. They might think, I barely remember what happened in January. My memory is probably wrong anyway. But they need to understand something. Investigators don't need you to have all the answers. They don't need you to solve the case for them. They just need you to provide one small piece of information that connects to other small pieces they already have. You saw a white van on January 11th near Nancy's house? That might match surveillance footage from another camera. You sold tape and gloves to a nervous customer? That might match a suspect investigators are already looking at. You heard someone mention Nancy's name before she disappeared? That might be the link that ties everything together. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI, 1-800-225-5324. The Guthrie family is offering $1 million for information leading to Nancy's recovery. The FBI is offering an additional $100,000. That's $1.1 million total for information that brings Nancy home. If you were in the Catalina Foothills between January 11th and February 1st, if you live in that neighborhood, if you work in that area, if you have any information, no matter how small or insignificant it seems, contact the FBI, not the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the FBI. Because given Sheriff Nanos' credibility crisis, you want your information going to federal investigators who aren't dealing with political chaos and leadership failures. You want your tip going to agents who can actually act on it, because Savannah Guthrie's words should haunt all of us. Someone needs to do the right thing. We are in agony. It is unbearable. Nancy Guthrie deserves to be found. She deserves a proper burial. She deserves the dignity of being laid to rest with her family present. Her family deserves answers. They deserve to know what happened. They deserve to grieve properly. They deserve closure. And whoever is responsible needs to be held accountable. They need to face justice for what they did. They need to explain why they targeted Nancy. They need to tell investigators where her body is so her family can finally have peace. 53 days is too long. Every additional day is too long. Every day that Nancy remains missing is another day of torture for her family. Every day without answers is another day that whoever did this thinks they got away with it. If you know something, say something. If you saw something, report it. If you have footage, provide it. If you remember anything from those key dates in January and February, contact the FBI. Because somewhere in Tucson, someone has the missing piece that solves this case. Someone has the information that brings Nancy home. Someone can do the right thing. And 53 days in, with a family in agony and an investigation in crisis, that's exactly what needs to happen. Do the right thing. Bring Nancy Guthrie home.